Thank you everybody for being here today, and to Occupy Edmonton for inviting me to be part of this terrific panel. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this and to be in the group of people who would give up part of their weekend to think about these important things. I think it's really important to recognize that commitment.
Do you have enough time?
Yeah, that's perfect, thank you. And so, as was mentioned in the introduction, I work at the Parkland Institute, and the Parkland, as I'm sure many of you know, is a public policy research network affiliated with the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. We take a nonpartisan, evidence-based approach to the public policy issues confronting our province and our communities. We've not always been beloved by government and its allies. At some point you can ask me about the now legendary story about the time a former premier tried to order the president of the University of Alberta to shut down Parkland, just boom, shut it down. So that's why, in this context, the context of that sort of reception for the things that Parkland has said over the years, that's why the public policy debate was so surreal for many of us in the run-up to Budget 2013. We found ourselves at Parkland with some very unlikely allies in some of our calls for the provincial government to engage in revenue reform. And just to give you a sense of the company we seem to be keeping, Glenn Hodgson, chief economist of the Conference Board of Canada, was arguing that Alberta's leaders should look to modernize its tax revenue base. Jack Mintz of the University of Calgary School of Public Policy recently wrote the Alberta government should tackle tax reform. It was a strange experience at Parkland to be making arguments somewhat similar to those who are often supportive of conservative policies. So in this talk, I'm going to make the case for revenue reform. I'll lay out the difficulties of a resource over-dependent economy and address the myth that we are a big spending province, as has already been addressed. I'll point to key ways to undertake revenue reform and speak to the state of public opinion in relation to this issue, the issue of revenue reform. And I'm also going to make clear how Hodgson and Mintz and I are not really on the same page at all. To my mind, the province of Alberta has two related problems: revenue stream and rampant inequality. This is a province of haves and has-nots. Inequality is a problem as serious as revenue stream, and today I'm arguing that these two issues should be addressed together. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So you need to start by talking about Alberta's tax structure, and this should look somewhat familiar to you because it was a slightly different version of a slide Laurie showed. And what you see here, illustrated here, is Alberta's tax gap. You can see how if Albertans and Alberta businesses were in any other province, they would pay between 11 billion, the shortest line evident here in Saskatchewan and BC, and nearly 21 billion more in taxes, the longer lines extending out beyond the 20 billion mark for the province of Quebec. The province of Alberta could substantially up its tax take even without introducing a sales tax. This is the tax gap here in the province. It's huge. It's also important to recognize that Alberta is a low-tax jurisdiction, not just in a national context, what we're looking at here, but also in comparison with the United States. In Alberta, the combined federal-provincial general corporate tax rate sat at 25% in January 2012. For comparison, the combined federal and state corporate tax rate across the United States averaged 39%, just over 39% at the same time. So there's another tax gap. And it's not just in relation to the United States that we are an extreme low tax jurisdiction, also internationally. And here we're talking about Canada versus the international context. Canada currently maintains the lowest corporate tax rate among G8 countries. So we're an outlier both nationally and provincially in terms of tax revenues. And as we've heard from Laurie principally, Alberta currently maintains a constant rate personal income tax regime, the so-called flat tax. This means that provincial income tax is levied at a flat rate of 10%, with the result that regardless of income, people pay the same percent in taxes. They pay the same fraction of their income. Progressive income tax, which Albertans enjoyed through 1999 and which exists throughout the rest of Canada, sees people with higher incomes paying a higher fraction of their incomes in taxes. Okay, the next slide.
Oh, truthiness, yes.
We're all probably familiar with the concept of truthiness. Truthiness, things that feel true, you know, that you just know in your gut to be true. as long as you don't really look too carefully at the facts. Well, I think that here in Alberta, in talking about the flat tax, we need to invent another concept. We need to talk about fairishness. Things that seem fair, that kind of sound a little bit fair, that might be fair in some way, as long as you don't look at them very closely. So let's look a little more closely at the flat tax. Imagine two people. One has an income of $10. The other has an income of $180. The first would pay $1 in taxes, with $9 left over in their pocket for all other expenses. The other would pay, the one with $180 in their pocket to start, would pay $18 in taxes, leaving them with $162 in their pocket. The falsehood of the flat tax as fair is exposed in this dramatic difference in disposable income. The differences in options and opportunities between the person with $9 and the person with $162 puts the lie to the claim that the flat tax is fair. So if I go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The flat tax is one element that keeps Alberta the most unequal province in Canada. Inequality here is greater than anywhere else across the nation. The income difference that I've just referred to between the person with $10 and the person with $180 was not chosen at random. In fact, it reflects the difference in 2010 between the incomes of the bottom 90% of Albertans and the incomes of the top 1% of Albertans. The rich made 18 times what the rest of us made in 2010. This made Alberta, as this slide illustrates. My numbers have been taken out. That's kind of a miracle. Anyway, if we were able to see the numbers, you would see that Alberta is substantially higher than the rest of the provinces in Canada, and that it sits well above the Canadian difference in income between the bottom 90% and the top 1%. The gap between the incomes of the rich and the incomes of the rest of us has increased over time. This is important to recognize in relation to the Alberta situation as well. In 1982, the difference was 10 times. So someone in the bottom 90% was making 10 times less than someone in the top 1%. And as we've already addressed, it's now 18 times, or it was 18 times in 2010. So income inequality is not just increasing. Relative to the rest of Canada, it is accelerating. It's becoming greater here at a faster rate than elsewhere across Canada. Ultimately, the fairishness of the flat tax disguises a tax system that contributes to profound inequality. And you need to recognize, I think, when you're thinking about inequality, that excessive inequality is bad for everyone. It's not just bad for the people who happen to sit at the low end of things. It's bad for everybody. Excessive inequality harms individuals, families, and communities, and it's been shown to contribute to a number of social ills, and Laurie was highlighting some of that data for us. Further, and this is the really interesting point, the recent research has been pointing out from diverse national and international groups such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Conference Board of Canada. All these groups, these mainstream economic analysis groups agree that pronounced inequality represents a significant drag on economic growth. Inequality is not just bad for our communities, it's bad for our economies. We would all be better off, rich and poor alike, if we lived in a more equal society. Now, it can be hard to square the data on inequality in Alberta with the pervasive myth of resource wealth. The idea that we are all benefiting from petroleum resources, and that oil and gas riches somehow protect us from the realities of other places. For instance, one of the realities that we like to believe we're protected from here is the need to tax at a rate adequate to fund the basic functions of government, to pay for health, to pay for education, to pay for social services, for protection of the environment and regulatory functions of government. These are some of the public undertakings that work to ensure greater equality of opportunity for everyone, compensating to some extent for differences of unearned privilege related to economic status, race, and gender, and others. We're a rich province, the mythology runs. Surely we don't need the sort of taxes that other places do. The next slide, please. Well, there's a problem with the sort of resource wealth that we have here in Alberta. It is enormous, as Kevin was highlighting, but it's also extremely volatile. Oh, good, the numbers are there. It's easier. Since the mid-1990s, as you can see on the slide, the proportion of provincial revenues made up of resource revenues has varied from 15% about to over 40%. That's a huge variability. Over-reliance on resource revenues has left Albertans at the mercy of international markets, with our ability to afford basic services tracking along with the price for Alberta hydrocarbons. Over-reliance on volatile resource revenues is a big problem. This is where the Parkland Institute agrees with the Conference Board of Canada and the U of C School of Public Policy. That's the extent of our agreement. Parkland, of course, sees a further problem, and I'm sure it's obvious to everybody here in the room. Oil and gas are not renewable resources. Funding basic services out of oil and gas revenues, in effect, steals from the future. Other countries have managed to amass substantial savings on the basis of our resource wealth, savings which will benefit their populations far into the future. We have not done this here in Alberta, as my other panelists have been explaining. And this is without even considering the environmental implications of fossil fuels, which we all know to be substantial. Resource wealth does not provide a reliable source of funds for any substantial portion of ongoing and necessary government spending. If Albertans are to benefit from the stable, high-quality public services, such as roads, healthcare, and education that we all need, the provincial government must establish a sustainable revenue stream that is unaffected by the volatility of international petroleum markets. So if I could have the next slide, please, thank you. When faced with perceived fiscal constraint, some politicians and pundits claim that the problem is that Alberta has a big spending province, and Kevin was addressing this in detail. I'm going to provide a bit of an update. I think Kevin's data ran through 2007, and I'm going to take us a little closer to the future. And it confirms what Kevin was already claiming about the earlier period. Claims about Alberta's exorbitant spending are simply incorrect. They're not borne out by the data. This is quite clear based on the data that I'm presenting you here. These are not from Statistics Canada. Unfortunately, the federal government, in its wisdom, has terminated the StatsCan series that made it possible to compare in an effective way spending across provinces. These are figures from Royal Bank of Canada. They're not quite as solid as the earlier StatsCan data that Kevin was highlighting, but they're also from a mainstream economic organization. They're the best data we have at this moment. And what we've got here, and again the numbers are here, that's good, we're looking at program expenses per capita. And you can see in 2008 and 2009 we were fairly close to the top, but over the subsequent years we've been in the middle of the road relative to other provinces. We've been a middling spender, not at the bottom of the pack, not at the top either. And I think it's important to note, this is in fact a really significant point, that this data here does not account for inflation. It does not account for how things cost more in the province, as we all know, as we all experience in our day-to-day way. So while we may be paying for government services at a fourth place rank, that doesn't mean we're benefiting from fourth place level services. We might even be benefiting or experiencing 8th level services, or maybe even a more dire scenario than that. If you look to the second column, we've got program expenses relative to GDP. And we're dead last. Expenditures by GDP is key if you consider the question of affordability. We are spending less of our GDP on government services than any other province in Canada. We could afford to do better. So evaluating provincial expenditures on a per capita basis puts the lie to the claim that Alberta is a big spending province. There's no factual justification for claims that the province has a spending problem. So if we accept the reality that revenue reform is necessary and the need to address it in tandem with the problem of accelerating inequality, what do we do? Oh, the next slide, please. Well, one thing we might do is we might cut corporate tax breaks. And at the beginning, I worried quite a bit about the fact that the title was going to get cut off, but seeing as this is the third time you've seen this slide, I think most of you can probably recognize it. And what it's illustrating is how over the past 20 years, corporations operating in Alberta have amassed substantial wealth while making consistently very limited contributions to funding the services, such as health and education, that Albertans need, or even to covering the costs that corporations impose on the provincial government, such as those for infrastructure, environmental monitoring, and regulation. Now, comparing corporate profits and taxes makes this clear, and you see the skyrocketing profits and the flat line of taxes. The next slide, please. Considering the foreign ownership of the major corporations operating in Alberta, low corporate taxes amount to a transfer of wealth out of the province and out of the country. And here you just see an analysis of the ownership of some of the major corporations operating in the tar sands. So presently, Alberta's corporate tax rate of 10% is tied with New Brunswick as the lowest in Canada. Alberta has raised its corporate tax rate to 12% without any risk even of sacrificing competitiveness. An increase of 2% would, according to government estimates, result in an increase to government coffers of $840 million. We should also bear in mind that some of the richest and most powerful corporations operating in Alberta are also given corporate welfare in other forms. And here I'm talking about our embarrassing low royalty rates. Next slide, please. In 2012-2013, for instance, the government aimed to capture only 10% of expected petroleum revenues. Under Lougheed, the target was 35%. So in dollars and cents, the failure to uphold Lougheed's revenue sharing target cost the provincial government $22.3 billion last year alone. If you combine royalties and taxes, the total government of Alberta take puts us behind nations such as Angola. Albertans, as Kevin has made clear, are the owners of the oil and gas resource. We are entitled to the proceeds. These revenues should not be used to fund core functions of government, but they should be used to create a legacy for future generations, as well as to ensure all Albertans are amply compensated for the harms we endure through hosting the largest industrial project on earth. Doing so could promote greater equality of opportunity in Alberta for the long term. And if you are really serious about dealing with both revenue stream and rampant inequality, you would certainly support a return to a progressive income tax. The flat tax benefits higher income earners by drastically reducing their tax rates. At the same time, as Alberta moved to a flat tax, Alberta also moved to a higher deduction from $10,000 to $17,000, which provided some assistance to those with lower incomes. But these changes had the effect of shifting the tax burden onto the middle class, which now contributes a larger share of tax revenues. Now, if I could have the next slide, please. This figure compares current Alberta income tax revenue to the revenue that Alberta would generate if it adopted the income tax system employed in each of the other provinces. The red bar is the revenue Alberta collects. You can see that the vast majority of the provinces, almost all of them, collect far more than we do through income tax, their progressive income tax system. BC is the outlier. BC, if we imported the BC tax system and applied it here in Alberta, we would in fact generate less. However, you need to recognize that BC would still be leading us. If we imported the BC system, we would still be leading in the fight against inequality. So BC system trails in terms of revenue generation. It leads in terms of equality because of how it is progressive. Now, just briefly, I'm running out of time, but I do want to touch on this. If I could go to the next slide, please. I'd like to talk about the opinions of Albertans. The myth here, of course, is that nobody's in favor of taxes. We're all anti-tax. Nobody wants to pay tax. Let's keep our dollars in our pocket. Well, that's just incorrect. It doesn't jive with the sort of data you get if you conduct opinion polls. This is a poll that was run by the University of Alberta in the spring of 2012 on behalf of the Parkland Institute. People with higher income should pay a greater share of the taxes than they do now. So support for that question, to say you agree or strongly agree with that question, you would be saying that you are in fact in favor of progressive taxation. 60% of Albertans agree. Even when asked the more direct question, would you be willing to pay higher taxes to improve public services? 40% of Albertans agree, would stand up and say, yes, I will pay more. And I think if you'd frame that slightly different, if you'd ask, would you be willing to pay higher taxes to maintain the same level of public services or to avoid cuts, you would see even substantially higher numbers. So I think what we're seeing here is the myth of Alberta as a tax-hating province, if I could have the next slide, is in fact untrue, and that it's a creation of certain circumstances perpetuated by people with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Low taxes are the Alberta advantage, we're told again and again. Looking at the matter more closely, the argument falls apart. And I think it's because Albertans do recognize something. They recognize that taxes are not just about revenues, they're also about fairness, about equity, and about community building. Taxes are the means through which we, as citizens, pool our resources to fund the efficient programs and services that we all need, from healthcare to education to infrastructure. The provincial government, ultimately, we would argue at Parkland, should follow the lead of its citizens, as their opinion was expressed in polls like this and in others recently taken, and work toward ensuring a fair, stable, and sustainable revenue stream for the province. Thank you.